Good morning, everyone. I'm Naomi Shihab Nye, here to welcome you to a tribute to Roberto Bonazzi, our beloved friend of Texas, of letters, poet, editor, publisher, teacher, who died this past October. With me to celebrate Roberto are Jim LaVilla-Havelin and Cary Clack. And we thank you for coming to this session this morning. Roberto was a very valued member of our Texas literary community, as well as national and international literary community. And we feel very touched and honored to talk about him this morning. Poet Jim LaVilla-Havelin would talk jazz, baseball, cinema, writing, and politics with Roberto Bonazzi, often over a plate of pasta. Also, he misses so much Roberto's laugh, genuine, immediate, and tinged with some sarcasm. Jim is going to talk about Roberto as an editor as well as a friend. Jim LaVilla-Havelin.
Thank you, Naomi. What a pleasure to talk about our friend and what he meant to us. I'm going to actually note to begin with, I think Roberto would have hated this. He was the most humble, quiet, private man, and these kinds of things made him grumble. He was a bah humbug kind of person about stuff. He would have hated it. So I hope what we do would make him somewhat happy. And so what I want to start with is a list of Roberto's favorites. His favorite jazz man, Lester Young. His favorite filmmaker, Bergman. His favorite baseball player, contemporary, Nelson Cruz. His favorite poet, and this is hard because he loved the work of many, many poets and cared about them deeply, but I think he had the most profound sympathy with the work of Cesar Vallejo. I know this to be true because he regularly went to Vallejo for voice and stimulus and thought, and he used Vallejo's inspiration. So, as an editor, and this is an amazing list, from 1966 to the year 2000 as the editor of Latitudes Press, he published the work of, you know this list, Naomi, I'm sure, Octavio Paz, Macedonio Fernandez, Paul Celan, Rafael Alberti, Carlos Drummond de Andrade, Jorge Luis Borges, Stanislaw Lem, Carlos Fuentes, Ernesto Cardenal, Denise Levertov, Jose Emilio Pacheco, and then in North American writers, Thomas Merton, Mark Van Doren, Arthur Miller, John Barth, Robert Bly, Gary Snyder, Donald Hall, Vassar Miller, Paul Christensen, Naomi Shihab Nye, Charles Simic, Russell Banks, Ronnie Duggar, Ángela de Hoyos. The breadth alone of the people that he nurtured, believed in, published, edited, focused on, the breadth of that list gives you some idea of who this man was. For many years, he also was a critic in the Express News in a column called Poetic Diversity. And a few years ago, 2004, he edited an anthology of poets called In These Latitudes. And in the introduction to In These Latitudes, he writes of the 10 poets, these poets are perceiving midlife experience through a highly polished lens, expressing what most of us feel and in an intense, clarifying way, except that they find ways to express it. I actually talked to two of the people who are in that book, partially because they're friends and I wanted them to know we were doing this. Laura Quinn Guidry, who is in These Latitudes, writes, I met Roberto when I took his publishing workshop at Poetry at Round Top in 2005. He asked the participants to submit several of our poems in advance. He liked a couple of mine and had me read them aloud. I had published a few poems at that time, but I was essentially a poet in my mid-50s without formal training, who'd started writing 10 years earlier in the aftermath of the sudden death of my son. Roberto asked me to send him more poems, and we kept in touch. Thereafter, he was working on an anthology of poems by middle-aged poets living in Texas, whose work, quote, had generally been overlooked by the critical establishment, and thus, in These Latitudes, 10 contemporary poets came into being in 2009, edited by Roberto Bonazzi. With deep gratitude, I was one of the 10 poets. I learned a lot from Roberto during that process, the poems he chose and those he didn't, and why, the suggestions he made. He was always forthright and respectful. 8 years later, I was finishing my manuscript for Between Two Gardens. I told Roberto I would not consider publishing a manuscript unless he read it and offered his opinion. And she ends with Roberto's, he was always a man of words, and with many of his books on my shelves, I can savor them. And our friend Lahab Asaf Al-Jundi, who is also in the same volume, writes, it's not easy, as you well know, to write just a paragraph or so about Roberto. Even a page or so may prove challenging. Suffice it to say, I am grateful to have been in his circle of friends for a few of the years that encompassed his long career, which included so many contributions to poetry and to literature in general. I feel particularly grateful to Roberto for the support and encouragement he showed me in my work. He gave freely and with delight. I learned so much from the Maestro of Solitude. I feel like I'm a better writer just because of proximity to him, particularly during our poetry group sessions, which we shared, and during the time he was putting together In These Latitudes, which he honored me greatly by including my work in. And personally, for me too, in all of my books, Roberto's voice in my ear. The man, Roberto Bonazzi, had the best ear for work, for poetry, of any poet I have ever met. And he didn't just hear, this is where he was special. He didn't just hear what he responded to. He heard what you were working toward. And that gift, that willingness to understand your focus and make you better at it, golly gee, what can I say? You know, I mean, it's just, I actually found that I still have emails of Roberto's in my archive under his name. And we were talking about a poem by the poet Hugh McDiarmid, a poem called Island Funeral, because we were talking about jazz, and Island Funeral is about Bix Beiderbecke, among other things. And he writes to me, Old Hugh MacD, one of those old-fashioned intelligent poets who write nothing like I write, but at times something like you write, so I can see your attraction to Island Funeral. I must admit I didn't think it would carry me, but it did. Not so much as poetry. Yes, there is surely poetry in it, but as sparse, disciplined prose. Old argument. In any case, I love his sense of detail and precision and the patience to play it all out, to say it all. Bix was a surprise, but no doubt one of the surprises you treasure in this text. There are all kinds of poetry. And while this is not my favorite source, it's powerful and previously unknown to me. I've read some of his work, but not in years, and do not recall this one, although from a well-known book, of course, which one runs cross-referencing from time to time. If you had one book to look at of edited work that Roberto did of a poet, I would suggest you look at the resurrection of Robert Burlingame that he did for Multifarious Press, not Multifarious, for Mutabilis Press, bringing the remarkable work of a poet, Robert Burlingame, to us. And I'm going to finish with a poem by Roberto from his scribbling cure called Rigorous Freedom, because it's a jazz poem. Rigorous Freedom, take one. Rigorous freedom of jazz that Beethoven invented. Ellington, our Beethoven, in his trench coat of dignity, as blessed rhythm becomes our dance in all the arts. Take two. Prez wore music on his reedy sleeves. Lady Day sported white gardenias dying in splendor. Lester's story was naked behind a hipster's horn. Billy voiced instincts as a new instrument. They lived behind the beat as the next best thing to being alone. Take three. Bird roosted on that wave after swing, a dark wit in wolf's clothing, attacking symptoms of being, dizzy bebop's existential jester, reinventing time without a wheel, turning miles round midnight into Monket New. 4. Train don't run on no tracks. Jazz won't play station to station. Schedules and maps obsolete. Only detours here. Naima's refrain, terrain. Loco motion, unafraid of the dark. Rhythm section always on time. Jazz won't play station to station. Train don't run on no tracks. Take 5. She sang from a high balcony while he played her jazz Romeo. They were trapped in an epic studio, but improvised their way out. Her body, a stand-up bass, living solo across string theory, 2 hands, 2 ears, 2 minds, 1 heart attentive to a tone, a touch, a throb, a thump. Longing always for Arco love, 5 strings, reinventing grief as her spirit body blossoms into his ballad. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you so much, Jim. What beautiful poems and remembrances. We appreciate you, and I particularly loved those quotes from the writers you read speaking about him. Those were so touching and so eloquent. Thank you for your generosity and for being such a great friend to him always. Next, we welcome Cary Clack. our local friend, columnist and editorial writer for the San Antonio Express News. And we've asked Cary to talk about Roberto Bonazzi's particular role as literary executor for the literary estate of John Howard Griffin, who himself was the Texan from Mansfield, Texas, who wrote Black Like Me, a book that has been translated into countless editions and sold millions of copies. And Roberto had quite an unusual experience, being not only his friend for many years, and he considered Griffin his mentor in many ways, but also going on to marry Griffin's widow, Elizabeth Griffin, who would become then Isabella Griffin Bonazzi, and they would have a long and happy time together, and then he would carry on with publishing work about John Howard Griffin and Black Like Me, publishing Griffin's own work as well as his own texts. Quite an extraordinary experience as a literary executor. So, Cary, I found two quotes that maybe you would consider in your remarks if you care to. One comes from Gerald Early, Black scholar at Washington University, who wrote about the book Black Like Me. It disabused the idea that minorities were acting out of paranoia. And Roberto himself said, that's why Early is saying that book was important. Griffin revealed, this is going on to quote Gerald Early a little more, Griffin revealed that what people were saying was true. It took someone from outside coming in to do that. And what he went through in Black Like Me gave the book a remarkable sincerity. Would you just maybe comment on that first, and then I'll give you the other quote in a minute.
That's a great quote by Early. I've read that before, and I read that quote years ago before George Floyd. I've read that quote since George Floyd, and I connected directly because it took seeing a man die for 9 minutes for a lot of folks to understand what it is that a lot of African Americans, a lot of people of color go through. And so it's interesting to connect Early's comment with what Griffin's experience, with Griffin's experiment and experience, as well as with what happened last summer, because you can make a strong case. Well, I don't think there's and Roberto said this, there's no doubt about this, that no white person before or after John Howard Griffin had ever experienced what it was like to be Black. So people who saw George Floyd die last summer don't have the experience of what it is to be Black, but they received some tragic, horrific insight of what the consequences can be.
Well, Roberto would go on to say this after publishing a book called Man in the Mirror, John Howard Griffin and the Story of Black Like Me. He said, Black Like Me remains important for several reasons. It's a useful historical document about the segregated era, which is still shocking to younger readers. It's also a truthful journal in which Griffin admits to his own racism, with which white readers can identify and perhaps begin to face their own denial of prejudice. Finally, it's a well-written literary text that predates the, quote, nonfiction novels of Mailer, Capote, Tom Wolfe, and others. Any comments about?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, aspect.
He's completely right. It's a brilliant book, and the thing about it's hard. So you can't think of Roberto, at least for me, I can't think of Roberto. I think of John Howard Griffin, and there's sometimes when I have to remind myself that it wasn't Roberto who wrote Black Like Me, it was John Howard Griffin. That's how easily they have fused in my mind, and that is because of Roberto's remarkable advocacy of Griffin's work, and of course being his literary executor, and then just the whole strange but very beautiful and romantic circumstances of Roberto marrying Griffin's widow. But I think if Roberto had not been Griffin's literary executor, the book is still, Black Like Me is still a classic. It will still be read. But what Roberto did is let us know about the remarkable man behind the book. I mean, John Howard Griffin just had an incredible, remarkable life for only 60 years. And Roberto he's helped kept this classic work alive, but more than that, he's helped kept the legacy and memory of the man himself alive. Can I read something of Roberto's his afterword of Black Like Me?
Yes, sure.
Okay, and this is from the 2016 version, and it's the afterword of the book. And I'm not going to read all of it, just a couple of minutes of it. 45 years ago this autumn, John Howard Griffin embarked upon his now famous 1959 journey through the Deep South, disguised as a Negro. He risked a bold experiment based upon a simple but provocative premise never before tested. His intention was to experience daily life as a Black laborer and to keep a journal with absolute truthfulness, even if his discoveries proved to be prejudicial, embarrassing, or naive. His honesty was tested the very first time he looked at the mirror to examine his disguise. There he perceived the face and shoulders of a stranger, a fierce, bald, a very dark Negro, glaring back at him. This powerful passage from Black Like Me reads like a loss of identity scene in a modern literary novel, but it was not fiction. Within that illuminated instant, his sense of self, physical, mental, emotional, had been thrown into chaos. But who would glare at whom? Was he the dark face reflected in the glass, or the white consciousness reflecting upon it? Soon he would reveal that he was both, the observing one and the one who panicked. Griffin had projected his deepest fears onto the mirror, causing him to deny the truth of what he had witnessed. The emotional prejudice that intellect had long rationalized was exposed by his unexpected reaction of antipathy. The worst of it, writes Griffin, was that I could feel no companionship for this new person. I did not like the way he looked, but the thing was done, and there was no possibility of turning back. Then I want to go to the very last paragraph of this afterword, because this is Roberto, and I can hear Roberto saying this. Look around, sisters and brothers. The global village arrived while we were out to lunch or napping through reruns of starving children on the death panel. Look inward to the Great Spirit and know that the reality of human nature has been and will always be universal. Black like me means human like us. Roberto Bonazzi.
Wow. That's very, very moving passages. And Cary, could you maybe just for one more minute say something about, to me it seems like an overwhelming task to be someone else's literary executor. It's hard enough to be a writer in your own body with your own self, but to represent another person's legacy of work and live up to the standards that have been set and be responsible to all these different texts and deal with all of the editors, publishers in ways that you would have to deal with them. I mean, it just seems like an enormous, enormous task. I think I've only known two people in my whole life, Roberto Bonazzi being one, and Kim Stafford being the other, with his father, William Stafford. took on the role of literary executor with such responsibility, such seriousness, such investment. Roberto's last book was Reluctant Activist from TCU Press, a book that we strongly urge any
Yes.
listener today to purchase. This is a powerful book about someone else's life, with which Roberto wrote in the last years of his own life. And could you just say something about, what you think that would take? What sort of resources of spirit to be the executor for someone else's massive archive?
I think part of it is that it's one person taking on and advancing the legacy of another person who is very much the same person when it comes to spirit and when it comes to their outlook on life and their heart. Obviously, you couldn't do this. You wouldn't do this if you did not first of all like the work of the writer. But if you didn't feel some special connection, and that's the word spiritual, which when you think of Griffin and when you think of Roberto, it's an easy word. There's something within their work, but also with the connection. And I had Roberto, and in 2011, I guess it was the 50th anniversary, and this will be the 60th anniversary of Black Light being published. But around the time of the 50th anniversary, Roberto wrote a piece for the Express News about Griffin. And he talks about the first time he met him. Him and a friend of his went to go visit Griffin at his home. I guess it was still in Mansfield somewhere, but and he hadn't read all of his work then, but eventually he would. But they were just so taken by Griffin. And one of the things that Griffin told them in that first meeting was the importance of solitude for creating art, the importance of solitude for writing. And if you look at a lot of Roberto's poems, there's a couple of words that come back again and again. Solitude, and what's the other word I was thinking of? But solitude is so often mentioned. I mean, one of his books is The Maestro of Solitude, and I think it was Jim commented that Griffin was truly a mentor to Roberto. And if you don't have that type of feeling, that type of relationship, that type of father-son, mentor-mentee relationship, there's no way that you would dare take on someone else's literary estate, especially when you're a brilliant writer on your own and you've got your own work to do. But he did it magnificently, and we're the better for it, and the legacy of John Howard Griffin is the better for it.
I think Naomi, Cary, the word that comes to me is generosity. Also. A generosity of spirit, which he showed not just to the work with Griffin's work, but to all of us. I mean, each one of us experienced that. For this is the great paradox of Bonazzi, is for a solitude person, who used to get on my case for doing too much out in the community and not getting down to my work, for that person to be as generous and open and nurturing as he was. That paradox is Bonazzi.
I think you've touched on the utter essential paradox and curiosity of his nature, because he was so solitary. It was often very hard to get him to go out and participate in literary activities in the city, for example, because he was so focused on whatever he was doing at his desk. But there was that well of generosity that he was working out of. So maybe he just realized he couldn't do it all. Thank you both so much for your wonderful comments. And I'm going to speak a little bit about Roberto Bonazzi as a mentor. But first, I'd like to read his poem, Meditations in Monument Valley, which I had the opportunity to publish in the Texas Observer, a longtime Texas publication that he and I both love, in the year 2000. Meditations in Monument Valley. The intricate knot opens into a simple sentence when we step from our skins to be named. We hear the notes of Mozart that Beethoven erased, then listen for the silences Bach could not compose. Harmony without strings strums a mute guitar. Stars explode in the next life. Well, I agree with Jim. I agree with you. I had some feelings of haunting this morning, thinking he might be a little annoyed with us for doing this today. But I think secretly he would also be pleased that we wanted to talk about his various facets and his own life in our lives. And I do think the position of mentor is one that needs to be talked about more. For all of us, you know, who could use a little encouragement right now? I mean, that's a question we can ask ourselves every day, wherever we are, whatever we're doing. Who could use a little push forward, a little help? I wanted to read a quote without his permission. I didn't get him. He just wrote me this yesterday. The writer Thomas Ziegel in Austin said this about Roberto. I remember being enthralled by Bob when I first met him. He was everything good that his friends liked about him. Supportive, but a tough critic. Impressively well-read. Cosmopolitan. Whip-crack smart and funny. A man of the world. I felt all those same things when I first met him. And I also felt the power of his enthusiasm for other people the very first time I met him. I met him when I was still in college. I was 22 years old, my last year, and I was at the Texas Commission on the Arts for the very first time ever. Little did I know that that office in Austin would become sort of the center of my compass for so many years. I was there to apply for a job as a writer in the schools, and he was in the lobby. He was pacing, I remember. He was not sitting in a chair, he was pacing in the lobby. And since I was the only other person in the lobby, he greeted me, said his name, and asked me what I was doing there. And I said I was there to apply for a job. And he said, oh, good luck. I'm here to pick up a grant. I said, what kind of grant? And he said, well, I have a small press called Latitudes Press, and I received a grant. I made an application, and I'm a poet. And that was possibly the first time in my life I ever identified myself to a stranger as a poet. And when you look back in your whole lifetime, even though I'd been writing since I was 6 years old, I had never said I am a poet to a stranger I didn't know. It seemed presumptuous. I hadn't published a book. I hadn't even published a chapbook. And I was applying for a job without even having brought any poems to show them. It was a crazy moment. I was very reckless. But he comforted me because he put out his hand when I said, I'm a poet. And he said, poets love to meet poets, or something simple like that. Great to meet you. Great to meet you. And let me know someday when I can see some of your poems. And then he was called in for his meeting. I was there probably 30 minutes early because I was so nervous. And then when he came back out and I was called in, he handed me a little slip of paper and said, here's my phone number. Here's my address. When you come back to Austin someday, come see me. But before that, mail me some poems, would you? And my wife and I would love to share a cup of coffee with you. He was about 8 or 9 years older than I was. So I was very touched that this stranger who was old enough to run a press and get a grant was inviting me to share some of my work. That had never happened to me before. So I took him seriously. I got the job without having any poems or any vita or anything. I was being sent out into the schools of Texas immediately upon graduation from college to work with kids and talk about poetry and encourage them. And so suddenly, at the same moment, I was in the position of encourager with a lot of doubt, a lot of fear. And I had an encourager, a person who had offered himself to me to read my work. What that would mean in the years to come, I could never have realized that he would be such a resolute reader of other people's work. Of course, I had no idea how many people he had said that to at that point, how many people's poems he was reading, how many comments he was making on other people's work. And thinking back on it, I realized that to be a good mentor required a selflessness of spirit. Because there was no ego in this for him. I mean, he wasn't trying to show off to me that he was smarter or had editorial wisdom. He just was very selfless about it. I'm curious, what is this person writing? He had a true enthusiasm for other people's work. Of course, I didn't know anything about Griffin. He wasn't his executor yet. I mean, this is 1974 I'm talking about. He had an immense appetite for a lot of text. I would find this out quickly when I saw stacks on his desk at his home. He had a big ability, a gift to suggest things about other people's work without offending the writer or without giving a feeling of judgment, which is something that seemed to me very precious, even in those early years. And he never had a desire to impose his own style upon me or upon, as you said, Jim, upon anyone. He was willing to consider work, to appreciate it, is exactly as you said, for what it was trying to do. He had an enormous intuition and insight about someone else's intention in their own writing. And for a 22-year-old who had never had a mentor of that kind before, I had not gone to a writing program. I had had the beautiful Robert Flynn as a fiction writing teacher at Trinity University, and I still consider him a mentor in the universe. He was such a great teacher and has remained that to so many people through time. But I never had anyone in poetry specifically wanting to look at poems and talk about lines. He made a big distinction between monologue and dialogue. And he would always say, I'm not trying to lecture you about these poems. Let's have a dialogue. Here are some questions I would ask you. And that made all the difference. He actually wrote up a gorgeous page that I used to pass out at writing workshops myself about the difference between monologue and dialogue. I tried to find it today so I could quote from it, but I've given all my copies away for the moment. So if any of you out there have them, please send me a copy back by email. Now, just for the sake of today, I was thinking about this mentorship position, and I was thinking about a poem a little girl wrote in China and gave to me that ended up being a favorite poem of mine for over a few year period. Her name was Crystal Zheng. She was in 10th grade, and she wrote about her mother passing on a pencil to her when she started in the particular boarding school she was in, and that she kept this tiny little pencil in her own pencil bag with all the pencils she was using, because that was like her mother's special treasure pencil that her mother had kept close to her during her own schooling. And Crystal's poem, The Pencil, struck me as it's like a child would keep a precious stone or a pearl, and something that they had that they knew was valuable in a certain way. But to me, what a mentor is doing is like taking his own best advice or her own advice and then trying to give it to you so that you could keep it in your pencil bag and apply it to whatever you're doing. I looked up what Aristotle said about mentors, and he said prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. And all of those seem to be words that apply to Roberto. And also, good mentors have to be lifelong learners. Well, Roberto was certainly that. He was always reading new writers, always passing on books. He shared more books with other people than any person I've ever known. And they have an appetite to pass that desire on to everyone they know. And yesterday I asked the wonderful writer Clemens Hurd, who's in San Antonio this year, working on his own project, what he thought about mentors. And he said, mentors are mortal deities in a way. They pass down the knowledge and privilege they've acquired thus far. My mentor opened up many doors I would have otherwise never known about or came to much later. So I guess a mentor expedites like your own labor in the field. Thank you, Clem. And only last month, I received a big trove of the letters I wrote to Roberto since 1974. His kind sister, Mary Frances Urey, returned them to me in a big envelope. And I feel a little nervous about reading them. I'm not sure I want to know too much about who I was in 1974, in 1976, and so forth. But I did want to find out some things that I had said to Roberto or that he had said to me. And so before we look at your questions, I'll just say a couple of things from that. He said to me in one of his first letters, "Be ready for tough, though not mean, criticism. When you send your work out into the world, you have to expect toughness, not softness." And I wrote back, "I'm ready for your toughness. I'm ready for anything. Indeed, risk is the word." He told me, if you're really going to be a writer, risk will have to be your word. You must embrace it always through your life. And he said, also, you have to be willing to change your pieces, not to cling on to things that don't seem to be working. And so I wrote him back, "I have been fighting with the end of this piece. Do you think it's too sentimental? If so, where does it degenerate?" I mean, I was really asking him specific questions about what he would read. And then I was talking about another friend who read some of my poems and said, "You have to beware of being mawkish. Don't ever try too hard to teach a lesson." And I said to Roberto, "Am I trying to teach a lesson? What is the lesson?" And he was always willing to entertain, not only what he wanted to say about my work, but things that were worrying me, what other people said and what I was grappling with. How do I do this? How do I become better? He never held back. He was kind of mighty in his illuminating commentary. His commentary was long. He was so generous. And he never asked me later if I had taken his advice and on any piece. And that was interesting to me because I felt that he trusted me to make my own intuitive decisions. So thank you, Roberto, for being a mentor to me, to so many other people, for taking the time with our work, for teaching your students, but also for being willing to take so many pieces of paper in those days onto your desk and consider them with care and insight. Someone has asked us if we could talk more about Latitudes Press and Roberto's work with this press. At the time he created Latitudes Press, it was one of the only bilingual presses around. He was publishing a lot of work from people in Mexico. He was publishing work in Spanish and English. You mentioned Borges. He was publishing work from South America, Central America as well. What else could you say, Jim, about Latitudes Press?
Octavio Paz.
Yes.
Introduced Octavio Paz and great translations of Cesar Vallejo. I actually was looking at a Latitudes book he had given me years ago that sits next to another book by the same author from another small press, a prose poet named Marvin Cohen, who nobody reads and nobody knows, and who loved the baseball and who wrote prose poems with a delightful gift that make us. I love to look at the books of Latitudes Russell Hardin books, the Paul Christensen books that were edited by Roberto, to see the Roberto in them, even though, as we've all said, he didn't put himself into them. I look at them to find what he found in them, and it's an interesting. I also have to tell you, Naomi, I was reading his review from his columns in the Express News, his review of your father's book, and I was reading his introductory work for Michael's work, and I was thinking about him in terms of photography.
Yes.
Because Griffin also took photographs, and actually, and this is one of those apocryphal ones, but I love the story of Griffin having given his camera to Thomas Merton, who then took photographs.
Well, it was very much always a pass it on endeavor with Roberto. Yes, and we've been told that we have to wrap it up right now, but I thank you for bringing up those comments. And for Latitudes Press, we should mention that that was a publishing act that went on for years, not an act, but an intention, an initiative that went on for years, and that he did with great passion and compassion for all the writers he published. And I'd like to end with this from his own voice, because I think it's an important distinction to make at the end. I was never employed by a commercial institution, but have worked independently only. Roberto Bonazzi, here's to you. Thank you, Jim LaVilla-Havelin and Cary Clack, and thank you, our friends who checked in with us today. Thank you, San Antonio Book Festival, and please support the Nowhere Bookshop, which is sharing the books for the festival. Please attend other sessions today and tomorrow as you may. Thank you so much, Reluctant Activist. Farewell.
Are we out?
Are you guys still there?
I am.
Yeah.
We may not be live, but we're still. Did you see Glover's poem?
No. Did it come
in
up?
the chats? Glover Davis's poem about Roberto.
Yes. Oh, there's Roberto's picture. There it came up. Yeah, go back to the session. Oh, nice. Beautiful. That's so beautiful. Okay. Thank you all so much for doing this. That was really important what you both said. And thank you. Thank you so much for the different angles. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you, Roberto. We love you. All right. See you guys later.
See you. Love you.
All right. Love you.